to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
Hey everybody, we're back with another episode. Today's guest is Dr. Tyler Page. Tyler is the owner and director of Page Chiropractic and Sports Rehab. His multi-disciplinary clinic emphasizes integrative care, functional rehabilitation, and sports conditioning. After earning his Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology from Syracuse University in 2006, Tyler went on to graduate from the New York Chiropractic College in 2010. Dr. Page also holds a Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist certification through the NSCA. Tyler blends a competitor's and clinicians' understanding of the sport of rowing and its biomechanical demands placed upon the body. He shares this knowledge as an instructor at the Institute of Rowling Leadership at CRI, where for the past 4 years he has taught biomechanics and applied sports medicine. He lives in Niantic, Connecticut with his wife Erica, his daughter Isla, and son Finn. Sit back and enjoy today's episode, where we discuss the topic of tissue tolerance and capacity in the sport of rowing and special considerations that you should be taking if you're a junior athlete. Tyler, thanks for coming on this afternoon. I appreciate your time, and it's good to catch up with you, buddy.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. Thanks for having me on. This is a pleasure.
Awesome. Let's get into it.
Absolutely. Let's get going.
So let's have you talk a little bit more about your background, what you've been doing, your journey from being a high school rower into college, your career at Syracuse University, and then as you kind of segued into the chiropractic field and all those experiences, how that has shaped your work and what you look for when you're working with your patients and athletes.
Well, absolutely, Joe. So I'll start from the beginning, I guess. So growing up, I'm Canadian. I rowed at St. Catharines Rowing Club. So I grew up with a tremendous opportunity when it comes to what I had for rowing and rowing coaches. So I definitely developed a passion for rowing at an early age. So I went to actually 5 years of high school, because we had 5 years of high school back then. And then I was lucky enough to roll into Syracuse University. Got recruited, headed to the States, rowed for Syracuse for 4 years, loved it. Dave Reichman was my coach there, and you and I definitely know Dave pretty well. Rowing was great at Syracuse, but I also got a degree in exercise science. I know that's kind of the start basis of when I have my deeper education into the sport of rowing. So I obviously was training for SU for a long period of time, but also when I would go into class, I'm getting a lot of that exercise physiology at the same time. So going back to that, when I graduated Syracuse University, I was lucky enough to get into Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College, which is a very high-end school in Canada. There's only one English-speaking chiropractic college in all of Canada. So it's pretty strict to get into, and it's very evidence-based, and I was very proud to get into that. Spent a couple of years with that. Then I transferred down to New York Chiropractic College, which allowed me to do two things. I got married to my lovely wife, Erica. And then it also allowed me to go to school close to Syracuse again, which it provided me with a second great opportunity through SU. And I was allowed to coach alongside yourself. And for those who don't know, that's where me and Joe met each other. Along with Joe, Coach Reichman, spending time with Dave, and really kind of getting into the coaching side of things. And I think that's really where I started blending my two worlds together, because I was watching high-end performance rowing, and then I was sitting in clinic treating athletes and the general population, finishing off chiropractic school down in New York, or Seneca Falls there is. So when I was seeing the two of them blend together, that's when I was starting to kind of really tie things together, and I was really getting interested. At the time I was doing chiro school, I also finished up my CSCS, similar to you. I do have a couple other certifications, ART certified. I do dry needling. I basically tried to build my toolbox as big as I could, because I saw that injuries, especially on the athletic side of things, there's so many different ways to tackle them. And it was definitely not just focusing strictly on the chiropractic side of things. It was blending the chiropractic, the functional training, and the performance training all into this one nice mold. And that's kind of where the world I have right now. The world I have right now, I do have a private practice. It's Page Chiropractic and Sports Rehab. It's located in Mystic, Connecticut. Along with that, I have been lucky enough to be a teacher at the Institute of Rowling Leadership at CRI's Boathouse since it started, actually. So for 4 years now, I teach biomechanics and applied sports medicine once a week. So I commute up there, and that's been a great, wonderful opportunity to keep opening some doors and keep building the knowledge of kind of try to get in some of this coaches' education out there, because I think there's a gap between performance training and injury prevention that I think we're doing a good job of filling, but I still think there's a lot of new research that needs to be brought to the field, and I think we can really bring up the rowing game. And kind of the last thing, I do coach a local high school team down here, Stonington High School. I'm the varsity coach. And this is my second year at the helm. I'm really excited. We're building some speed. We're looking pretty good for this year, but it's definitely nice to get back into the swing of things and coaching some young kids.
Awesome, man. That's great. Fantastic stuff. So two things to build off of what you were discussing there as you opened up. So you mentioned building your toolbox, making it as expansive as you could. You clearly are taking a very integrative approach using a lot of different modalities. Why do you feel that is so important to be effective as a practitioner?
I think that's the basis of the more you can get developed in, like, there's never one cure for anything. There's no one cause, one cure. And if you're a hammer, all you see is a nail. So if you have one treatment and that's your go-to, you're going to find a way to treat around it. Whereas I'm really evidence-based in what I do. I want to make sure that I follow the latest and greatest that's published out there. And in order to do that, you really have to be well-versed in multiple different areas. And multiple different areas both being what kind of injuries you're seeing, how you're going to treat them, how you're going to rehab them, and how you're going to prevent them. And it's rarely to find everything like that in one package, where you have to beg and borrow and kind of piece things together what best fits the patient. And the more tools in your toolbox, the more chances you have to really treat the patient and the athlete with the best of your ability.
Yeah, you're spot on. That's so important. Because it's never a one size fits all approach. You have to kind of pull from different areas, and find the solution that works for the individual.
Absolutely.
So the other part that I want you to expand upon there is you mentioned the gap between performance, and injury, right? Correct?
Yes.
So can you kind of go into that a little bit more and talk about sort of where you see that gap, where it currently stands, and where we need to go?
Okay, sure. I think when you take a look, if we're focusing solely on the basis of rowing and we're looking at performance training, I don't think it's I guess the best way to put it is, it's safe to say that a lot of coaches are really good at building a training plan. And I think if you took a lot of the great coaches out there along the lines of how to build a proper, whether you want to do a fully cyclical periodization training plan, I think there's a lot of coaches that can do a lot of great evidence. I think that when you can get a whole bunch of great minds in a room, very commonly do you find somebody who isn't great at kind of tweaking and making a good training plan. But I think what a lot of people start feeling is when you start taking that training plan and and opening it up, almost expanding it out a little further and going, okay, what are we doing outside of rowing? I think we are great on training. I think we're great on rigging. I think we're great on equipment. But where are you in rehab or prehab? Are you preventing injuries? Do you have strength and conditioning? Where do you time that in your day? Where do you time that in your training plan? How much and how you kind of break off into each one of those segments is probably the hardest part about it, and where I see the biggest gap. Because from my experience, both teaching and seeing in clinical practice, a lot of the times the athletes are being injured not in the training plan. They're being injured in a supplemental part of their training plan. So so if we're talking rowing, it's not necessarily the daily rowing. It's the accessory type of stuff they're putting in there, or it's their, how they're timing things, or it's so deep, it's hard to kind of really make it simple. But if you go into it even further, it's not necessarily like taking the strokes in the water that's injuring them. It's the cumulative of tissue capacity and tissue tolerance that we're really missing. Mm-hmm. And it's that gap between, what are you doing to prevent injuries and what are you doing to get your fastest boat? And I think that's the area that's really got to get developed.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that's spot on. So building on that, All right. How do we take that next leap? Right. So what are some of the things, obviously you're teaching, up at Boston. What are some of the things that you're trying to bring to the students who are going to be going out and being coaches now, right? Some of the wisdom you're trying to impart to them so that the program that they're putting together for their athletes is very complete. It's not just, okay, this is what we're doing around the sport of rowing. Don't forget, you still need to be a human being and, move well too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of funny. That's the basis of the two classes. And at the end of the two classes, you can really, I always tell them, like, you should be really confident in what you put down from now on, because we've gone through every different stages. But kind of going into it, the first thing we talk about, and again, it's not my personal conjecture. I start the lecture, or when I first get the IRL fellows in front of me, is like, guys, you can question me on whatever you want, because what I'm presenting to you is what's published in the research field, what I can find on rowing, what I can find on injury prevention, and really updating you, really kind of keeping things current. And a couple of the things that are the biggest basis that the first couple lectures really hit them hard is go, wow, that is nothing like we tried to do for training. So if we want to go into a specific example, I think if you take a look at a lot of people's training plans, and let's go into their accessory type of trainings where they're injury prevention. It's a big buzzword, injury prevention, or prehab. Let's build up a tolerance. I think the biggest mistake that coaches make is the core exercises that they're doing, working core strength, not core endurance, and the timing of when you do those exercises. If you can hit those three things correctly, you're going to watch a significant amount of injuries decrease on your team. But I can guarantee you those three things, a lot of coaches in a good attempt to try to build up what they believe is helping their athletes, could actually be hurting their athletes.
Right. And you mentioned kind of those three steps there: core, endurance, strength, and then the timing aspect. And I can't help but notice what triggered in my mind immediately. I think you know where I'm going with this is, Dr. Stuart McGill, right? And that's
absolutely
one of the first things he talks about is building up that endurance and capacity for those soft tissues, specifically into the around the low back, because that's what he's known for. So let's get into that. Why is that important?
So if you look at the low back, and let's break it down to everything that it is. If you take it as its simple measure, whether it's a bone, whether it's a cartilage, whether it's a ligament, muscle, or tendon, it's a tissue. It's a tissue. It's a tissue. And every tissue has a capacity for work and a tolerance for work. And when we take a look at the rowing stroke, I think the best way to describe how a back is injured in a rowing stroke is Mike Boyle. Mike Boyle, very popular strength coach, great guy. He follows the rule, but he had probably the best analogy, and he wasn't talking about rowing, but he was talking about lower back. And he said, think of a lower back like a credit card. It has only a certain amount of flexion and extensions before it breaks. And what you'll see is you'll start to see that card bend back and forth a couple of times, and you'll get a white line. And then you keep flexion extending it, and then eventually it'll break. And I think that's one of the best examples I can use on the rowing stroke. The rowing stroke, if you are doing the rowing stroke correctly, there is still a level of flexion extension into that lumbar spine. If you're really clean at it, a lot of it does come through your hips. And that's, again, I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later. But getting into that flexion extension, when we look about building up a lower back and building up that kind of area, we build it up. We need to make sure we don't use those flexion extensions, because we were already using them in a rowing stroke. So when we go back, I'm kind of going off topic a little bit, but when we go into building that back up again, are you using some of your flexion extension cycles while you're on the water, in your rehab, in your strength and conditioning, and then you're wondering why you have a disc herniation at the end of your season or before the spring season even starts? But if we go back into protecting that flexion extension cycle, having the capacity to stabilize your core prevents you from getting that excessive wear and tear. Start using up those flexion extensions. And it's not important to be able to resist a very heavy flexion extension. It's being able to support your entire core for a prolonged period of time. And that's the biggest misconception, especially when it comes to core training. I'm not interested if you can do, a sit-up with 45 pounds on your chest. I'm interested in if you can hold your proper position throughout your proper core stability throughout a prolonged period of time, so I don't have to question you throughout an entire hour and a half practice.
Right. Yeah, and that's usually the first thing that starts to go, right? Is that as the athlete fatigues, they break down. You start to see that rounding of the upper back, slumping in the low back, and the posture goes.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about building up that conditioning, that endurance in the low back.
And building up that endurance prolonged, and that's really taking everything into a posture. It's funny, you mentioned that it's the first thing that goes. And I think that's one of the biggest common mistakes that you see in some junior rowing coaches is you can hammer technique all day long and you can have that perfect mind's eye of how you want to look on the water. But if you're taking an athlete who's new to the sport, there's a lot of physiological adaptations that have to happen for them to get that nice, clean rowing look. And one of them specifically is developing a lot of that core endurance to be able to hold that posture for a long period of time. So if you're taking a brand new introduction athlete into the sport and you're asking them to put a high tissue tolerance into them and tissue capacity by asking them to row for a long period of time with this perfect technique, they may not have the absolute background to do it. They maybe came from an unathletic sport, or they did a sport that was so different from rowing, they never have asked their body to challenge or their central nervous system to actually keep this posture for a long period of time. And we think it's just technique or the athlete hasn't done it, but they simply haven't developed that base or that platform of support to build upon to get that nice, clean look.
So to kind of, I guess, summarize a little bit of what you're saying. So making sure that we're not progressing the athlete too rapidly, whether that's with the volume of training or the intensity, or overloading the central nervous system. So it's too much stimulus and the body goes sort of into a state where it tries to survive a bit.
That's when you're gonna see the cheating or the adaptation into the body. Like at rowers, you can see the postures, and we all know it. It's the slumping at the finish. It's the overactivity of the hip flexors. It's the kind of shoulders get a little bit raised and they don't have that same postural effect. And I think it's great that there's a lot of technique that needs to be done in this sport, but there also has to be a caveat, especially at the younger levels, of understanding how much is the rower not doing it or how much is the rower not capable of holding it for that long period of time.
Absolutely. So because, especially with the junior athlete, these individuals, boys or girls in that 14 to 18 age bracket are still very much developing as a human being, right? Their body's still growing. They're still probably going through puberty. So they might, be continuing to get taller, putting on muscle mass. So there's beyond just the training aspect, we have a lot of physiological change going on at the cellular and hormonal level, right? So it's sort of almost the meeting of the perfect storm. They may be, much more prone to injury risk because their body is almost in a perpetual state of change.
Absolutely. And it starts off if you're talking about high school and you're looking at the freshman level, you can look at things like Osgood-Schlatters, Seaver's disease. It's more of a growth plate type of, it's an overuse injury affecting growth plates or just non-ossification of certain unions of the body. It can happen to a lot of different things, even simply a shin splints or just uncoordination. There's so much that's being developed at this younger level. And it's not that it could be to the point that your development coordination or even your muscular system hasn't changed. Like even myself, I see some kids come back between their sophomore and junior year and I don't recognize them. They've grown a foot or they've put on a lot of muscle mass, and it's amazing to see this progression go through. I actually embarrass my seniors because they have this, we have a pretty good shaped senior crew and they're in great shape and they're jacked and they're looking good. And you look back to their freshman year fall photo and they're $120, 5'4". Now they're looking at 6 feet and it's significantly bigger, but it's pretty big change that happens across the whole time.
Yeah. Huge changes. So to tie it back in and circle back to what you said earlier. So you mentioned, building up that tissue capacity and that tissue tolerance, right? And, one of the biggest, issues may be trying to train that in the sport, in the prehab, rehab, or in the strength and conditioning. So what are some, applications that an athlete or a coach may be able to integrate into their program that will add benefit, and complement what they're doing on the water, but not overextend that flexion extension cycle?
I think the biggest thing that needs to be, I guess my biggest tip that I could give a coach, especially if you're running a high level, college program or even a high level, performance junior program, is timing. And I think we're really good at looking at, what the athlete does during their rowing practice. But are we looking at what's going on and tying everything in together? So when you look at tissue tolerance or tissue capacity, that's not tissue tolerance or tissue capacity throughout that practice. It's that practice along with their day, along with what they did the day before or the week before. So let's go to college for a second. Let's just start with them. If you take a look at the tissue tolerance of a low back in the college rower, and you have to take in consideration a couple things, what your training plan building on, but also let's use the example of in the spring season, right? Riding a bus for 5 hours from Syracuse to Boston uses up some of your tissue tolerance. You had to sit on an uncomfortable bus. That will affect the fact that when you get off that bus, you're going to have a change in that tissue leading into what's the practice, or what do you do before you step into a boat? Do you just get the bus to come to the boathouse, unstrap the boat, rig the boat, and get going and start doing some starts? Mm-hmm. That's a quick example, but more kind of diving deeper into it is, what day do you do your core? And I always trip up coaches. What do you do? Now, if we're looking at taking your tissue tolerance into an example, if you're using up and you're doing a long steady state day and you're asking your rowers to maybe do 2x10K, Dave's favorite workout at Syracuse, or in the fall, if you're doing a long time trial in pairs, or just a long swing row, is that the day you do core? And most people try to link up that day. Okay, we didn't go hard, we went long. Is that the day to do core? And a lot of people do their core on their steady state days. And I'll tell you, that's a mistake. You've used up that tissue tolerance. Rowing itself is a physically challenged core activity. And although you didn't do it heavy, you did it for a prolonged period of time. Now you're taking that fatigued muscle and then you're going to fatigue it further by trying to do your injury prevention training. And no matter what you do, let's say you use sit-ups or you like crunches, you now flexion extended that low back and forth for an 80-minute swing row. And then you took those athletes in with a fatigued core, limited stability, and maybe developing some of synergistic dominance where you're cheating, your core stabilizers you'd like to activate are working, are fatigued. So your smaller kind of helper muscles, which should be helping, start taking over, like your hip flexors, your IT band. You start getting your hamstrings going. And they are now going to do your core exercise. So you've taken the fatigued muscles. You're kind of in that zone of, all right, I've already used up a lot of my tissue tolerance and tissue capacity during my swing row. Now I'm going to put myself into an exercise that I'm going to do it with limited stability. Not because I over pushed it, because I pushed it for too long. So if you do get a good core training in, or a training, I don't want to say good, are you doing it to the effect that you want it to? Are you using the muscles you're hoping to train? Or are you just further ingraining a motor pattern or a muscle firing activity of the synergistic muscles that have picked up where your actual core muscles have dropped off? And that's the biggest mistake I see, or just common misconception. And you can take that one step further. If you look how to herniate a disc, I get questions all the time. How do you herniate a disc? I got a herniated disc from rowing. How do I get it better? Or how do I prevent my athletes from getting a herniated disc? Read Stu McGill. The guy knows how to herniate a disc. And it's not from taking two bones and squishing them together. It's the repeated flexion extension cycle. And if you take a look at what a lot of the activities we do for exercising our core, not only is it creating an unbelievable amount of compression, newtons of force between the two vertebrae, we're doing that and then using that low back as a flexion extension. So bring it back to that last example I just said, and let's bring it into the flexion extension. We now took our core. We did an 80-minute swing row. We fatigued our core. We're using synergistic muscles, or the muscles that are basically left over, to help out our core, are now taking over. And we're going to do it one last time, but we're going to do it with a flexion extension cycle. So not only did we just bend that back and work that disc for 80 minutes during our swing row to a less extent, we took a fatigued core, loaded it up with an incredible amount of compression, and then during a crunch or a circuit or however, certain exercises that help core, we flexion extended it some more. That's where injuries start to happen. And it's a slow breakdown. You're never just going to all of a sudden be perfect and one day herniate a disc. You're going to work it out. And that's what happens.
That was great, man. That's awesome. Yeah, it's there's so much that you just packed into that response. Like, I hope everybody just takes a sip of water or something and just like lets their dendrites calm down there, because their brain may have exploded with all the knowledge you just imparted on the audience there. And that's so important, right? We don't necessarily need to be doing the core work on the high volume, low intensity day, right?
No.
And what is the athlete learning at that point? So they're already fatigued, right? And the central nervous system is already at a state where, it's kind of in a stress state. So one, they're not learning anything. They're probably not going to be in a good setup position. And they're, like you said, they're going to be ingraining a bad motor pattern.
And that's what you see a lot in rowing. And I'll kind of take it back a little bit, because I did kind of throw a lot in that last little rant I did. But one of the biggest thing you can start seeing, and I think you can see it with a lot of the rowers out there, is tell me if this is new. I have tight hip flexors and I'm a rower. I have a tight hamstring and I'm a rower. I have IT problems, or if I'm a rower. And all three of those muscles, if you take a look at it in a physiological and anatomical structure, are they not synergists to a lot of what we're trying to stabilize? Now, I'll argue all day long that a hip flexor on a rower has to be developed, because if you have a layback into a catch, it's one of the easiest muscles to activate that kind of release into that swing. Okay, I get it. And as well as when you take a look at physiological, one of the changes you have to have as in a rower is that hamstring length. And I think the longer you get going in rowing, the less you forget how hard it was to get that body's over posture at the beginning. But if you take a look at, if you have an issue of IT band, hip flexor, and hamstring together, has your coach ever checked your glutes?
Right. Are they working? Are they underactive?
Because that's the biggest mistake we make. Because you can look right at into that one simple area. And if it's part of your assessment, or if you have somebody who's lucky enough that can give you an assessment in the strength and conditioning area, that's one of the biggest things I see, not only in rowing, but in the general population or just general athletes you have, is that synergistic dominance, where your prime stabilizer, whether it's because it was injured in the past or simply doesn't have the capacity to act in full function, starts getting put in the past, and you start getting this almost cheating with some of the accessory muscles. And that's the hip flexors. That, we're talking, when I talk hip flexors, I'm not talking rec fem, I'm talking iliopsoas, I'm talking that level. And when we're talking, if you want me to break down the three levels of the hamstring, we could do that too, but let's kind of group those together. It's just hamstring for simplicity. Those are the synergists. They're the helpers, but you can athletes are great compensators. We're really good at getting around the cause, because we're going to get to our end goal. And when you take a look at that hamstring, that's big time. So if you're having a hard time with your athletes and you've stretched it, I'm not going to go on too big of a tangent on this, but if you stretched and you passively stretched your hamstrings and you can't get through it, check the glutes and take a look at what Joe's doing. But that's the biggest, you can unhook that whole level once you develop some stability.
Yeah, absolutely. You're getting into really touching on Vladimir Yanda's lower cross syndrome there, and that synergistic dominance, and I'm tight in the hamstring, I'm tight in the hip flexor, and we crank on it. We mash it with a tool, or and let's just hit the pause button for a second and go, why is it tight? Is it tight because there's an actual tissue extensibility issue, and we need to actually really get in there and do soft tissue work? Or is it a result of the central nervous system hitting the brakes and going, dude or dudette, I need to slow things down because you don't have control. And if I don't put the brakes on, you're going to fall or you're going to get hurt. So it tightens up and creates restrictions, or that tightness or hardness, whatever you want to call it, into the tissue or the joint, and restricts motion. It's a self-protection mechanism.
It's absolutely a self-protective mechanism. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions out there is thinking of muscles as this really, really smart, intricate part of our body. Muscles itself, I don't want to make it too simple, but muscles itself are pretty simple. They fire. If you take a look at an extensibility issue in a muscle, and let's go into the medical side of things, what's causing that muscle to be short is the biggest thing that I myself in practice get to see. Okay, I see somebody come in with an injury. Was it an injury that happened with a football injury? Like it's sudden, it's really simple, like I got this injury. Or is it an overuse injury? But if you take a look at a muscle length issue, why is that muscle quote unquote short? And I'll limit you, like, do muscles really have what is a short muscle? Answer that. It's not under that simple of a control. It's not like you have this rope and you need to loosen it up and then it'll forever be loose. It's what is the tissue quality? But if you're taking a simplistic muscle approach to it, if there is an old injury to it, is there some kind of adhesion or scar tissue? But the simplest way to do it is most of what we do isn't necessarily the muscle. It's the central nervous system or the nerves controlling that muscle. If you look at a spasm around, let's go back to the disc herniation. The spasm on a disc herniation has absolutely nothing to do with the muscles being injured or too short. It's a protective mechanism done by the body of a muscle that crosses the joint to tell you to not move it. It's reflexive. It's a spasm of that region to say, don't move this because I don't know what's going on and I don't want to prevent further damage. And if you look at down the line of other muscles, you have this intricate, absolutely balance between the central nervous system and the muscle. And a lot of the changes that you're made, both in good and bad, although the muscle gets all the glory, the central nervous system is the driver. If you take a look at a hypertonic muscle, you want to make a muscle from, I use bananas as units of measurement a lot. So let's say I got my quad and it's 8 bananas big, or it's circle, and I want to make it 10 bananas big. You know how long that takes? That's a significant amount of time. But I can get a strength increase in that immediately after a couple workouts.
And why? Neuromuscular. It's essential
neuromuscular facilitation. That's the same reason why I could take an athlete like a football player who's having a hard time laterally cutting in practice. And I could do a couple exercises with him. And then all of a sudden he gets a better cut, or he feels more confident, or we're doing a functional evaluation where, wow, I did this little quick exercise and now I can stand on one leg with my eyes closed for 2 minutes, where I could barely stand on it for 2 seconds. Did I make that muscle stronger? No. Did I release an adhesion or lengthen a tissue that was too short? No. But I facilitated the central nervous system to almost think about it more, or it kind of regrain that motor pattern. And we've used the term motor pattern a lot. Motor pattern is just the process of which you fire muscles. Mm-hmm. Do you fire it in the correct order, or do you fire it in almost a changed pattern to prevent injury or overuse or whatnot? But to get to the final end point of what we're talking about is a muscle's nothing without the central nervous system. And most of the changes which we do is central nervous system based, whether it's performance training, whether it's injury prevention or injury treatment. A hypertonic muscle has too much tone because it's getting too much tone from the central nervous system.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm such a big proponent of really training the central nervous system. And a lot of times when working with an individual or athlete, depending on where they are in their development, there may be a period where they have to do some unlearning, right? So you have to completely regress, slow things down, break it down to the simplest element, because they have compensated, or they have a behavior, or what they're doing is, like we talked about before, efficiency. They're trying to get from point A to B as easy as possible, because the brain is lazy. It wants to conserve energy. It wants to do the job as quickly as possible. It does not care about quality.
Nope.
So a lot of times it's what we're talking about is, making that change in the central nervous system. One is, and this goes right back to Dr. Stuart McGill, is that person aware? Are they in tune with their body? Do they even know that they're walking around in a slump posture, or are they breathing from their diaphragm? Or are they breathing from their neck and their shoulders? So that's the first step a lot of times. And, but yeah, the central nervous system absolutely drives everything.
No question about it.
And that's what helps really make inherent long-term change for the athlete, is when they groove that neuromuscular connection between the brain and the muscle, and it fires, and they own it.
And the way I describe this to patients and athletes of mine, it's much like handwriting. You are grooving a muscle pattern, and it's where it's coming from the brain, how it's traveling down the spinal cord, but also the coordination of muscles. Like if you start writing, like I use cursive, I'm old school, but I still go cursive, and I could do cursive with my eyes closed. Did I always have that? No. Or I have that motor control, and that's a really complicated thing to do. Or even going back to, I'm looking at my keyboard. How many of us think about where the keys are that much anymore? We just automatically know where to type them. That's a really easy example. But if you go into the world that we're talking about, into the sport of rowing and the motor patterns side of things, you can really start seeing, if you've ever coached where you had to bring together maybe a group of athletes from different mindsets or different schools, probably the easiest way to say, all right, at St. Catherine's Rowing Club, we brought together like 13 high schools to make our junior program for the summer and the fall. And however they rowed was just the way they learned how to row. And we always had to come together and kind of meld a bunch of people together. Maybe rowing in college is probably an easier example. A freshman coach who gets a bunch of athletes, recruited athletes from multiple different areas of rowing, whether it's an internationally different stroke where you're coming over to the States for college and it's a different mindset or a different pattern. That's your motor pattern. That's where you go to. You're going to go back to that inherently, not because you're trying to, but because you've grooved that pattern so much that's second nature to you. But if you take that into, applying it to movement of really back and bring it into training your athletes, you could develop those motor patterns you're looking for in a boat, not necessarily in the boat, because it may be difficult to take a rower and say, if you look at your body swing, you're not hinging from the hips. But if you have trained somebody, doing a really, really clever deadlift, or you bring it into, the injury prehab and rehab side of things, and you bring that in and correlate the two, then you have the groundwork for what you're trying to ask your athletes to change, or the groundwork to try to build of what you want to see come up. But if you just tell them the hip hinge and they have never had a hip hinge or never reinforced that hip hinge, that's like cursive. It's like, here's a crayon, you know how to print, now write. Well, I don't know where to start. Well, where are you starting from? So that's where I think that the worlds really could blend and help together is, are you facilitating already that central motor cortex of that change of how are we firing these muscles and stabilizing them and bringing them into the sport of rowing as a technique? And I think there's some people doing that. And I think that's a really easy way, whether they're doing it consciously of saying, okay, I'm really going after the motor patterns of this firing, or just saying, I find my rowers row better when we do deadlifts, or we do this certain Olympic lift, or we do this type of training, they seem to row better. And you may have fallen upon that naturally, not knowing that you are training that central nervous system. But I think that's where the two things, especially on the junior side of things, you can really do a lot of good with.
Yes, totally. That is absolutely what I try to work with and blend into the training for the rowers that I work with, regardless of whether they're a junior or a master or somewhere in between. I think the deadlift is one of my fundamental and staple exercises. I think it really on land training, I think it wonderfully complements the rowing stroke. Because you're doing an opposite pattern, right? So if we look at the rowing stroke, it's a lower body push and an upper body pull. And the deadlift, you have a lower body pull, and you're teaching the athlete to hinge through the hips. And I'm so glad we got to that, because we talk about hinging through the hips, and I've completely deleted from my coaching vocabulary the idea of bodies over or tilt or anything like that, because I found when I said to anyone I was coaching, go into the bodies over position, they immediately think to move from the torso, right? But I really want them to hinge through the hips, all right, and get that. So one, I want to prevent and make sure they're not flexing through the lumbar spine. And two, they're hinging through the hips, right? Is it going to be the same hinge as if they were on land doing a deadlift or a kettlebell swing? Absolutely not. They are not going to get their hips that far behind their ankles. But it's the idea and it's the motor pattern of shifting the weight, the body weight back behind them. So in the boat, the weight shifted from the back of the seat to the front of the seat.
Perfect. That you hit it right on the head with the point of saying, is it going to be exactly the same? No, it's not. It's very hard to replicate what you're trying to do on a rowing stroke on something other than a rowing stroke. But if you take a look at it, it's still teaching, ingraining that same movement. It's a movement pattern. If you take a look at how strength and conditioning, or even some of the different rehab have come through, we've made a huge jump. We are no longer doing Nautilus machines where we're sitting down on a machine, our back is against the support, and we're pushing away. We're doing functional training, functional fitness. Functional is the big buzzword when you take a look at the performance training gyms. Like if you look at an NFL training facility now and an NFL training facility maybe 10 years ago, it's completely different. The Syracuse University is different. And it's really based on that functional training. And what are you teaching? You're building movements. And are they movements that are exactly what you're going to do in your sport? Maybe not. But are they close? Absolutely. But you're moving your own body throughout space, getting this general body awareness, but also building up that motor firing, or the pattern of how you want to use it. And that's huge. That's absolutely huge when you take a look at what are you doing? You want to move better, and you want to move well, and you want to move more efficient. We've gone away from just X, Y, and Z. I want to push heavier, stronger, faster weights. I want to move well, and I want to be an athlete, not necessarily just an absolute force in the gym.
Yeah, I want to be a force in the gym. I want to move well. And when I get to be 30 or 40 or 50, I don't want to hurt.
Yeah.
I still want to be able to bend down and touch my toes and, not be in pain from what I did 20 or 30 years ago when I was younger. And that's what we're talking about, right? Improving the movement quality, the awareness outside of the boat. And one of the great things about doing all the work on land is that you have this environment, and we can create a very sensory rich environment, and we can really work with the athlete and cue them and get them in a position a lot better than we can on the water. And let's be honest, on the water, it's difficult for the athlete to really feel a lot, because the entire time they're sitting down, they're on a boat, and depending on the day, there might be current, there might be a lot of wind, so there's chop. They're not necessarily going to have great kinesthetic awareness. So on land, we can get them, instead of wearing shoes, they're going to be barefoot. So immediately we've already increased how much sensory information they're pulling into their body. All right. And then we can really work with them, help them get in a position correctly, slow things down, which isn't necessarily always, realistic when you're on the water.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the challenges of the sport of rowing is taking a look at what you want to get done and having it be accomplished while you're rowing on the water. I think one of the biggest things that changes in this, if you try to take our sport across the field of much of different types of athletics, is we sit down. We take a bipedal posture and now change it completely on its side. Is it easier to teach a hip hinge from someone standing on 2 feet? Absolutely. Teach a hip hinge with someone sitting down. Try it. They're all going to want to drop their shoulders forward and roll. It's very difficult with it, and it's almost, you almost have to over exaggerate it to try to teach it. And then you get this awkward, like too tall of a posture where you're just jamming your low back facet joints and creating this hyperlordosis or crease curve in your back to try to accomplish the fact that I want to swing from my hips. Well, that's not doing any good either. So it is definitely a challenge when it comes to the sport of rowing. Of not only are we sitting on a moving water, and most of the time you got to coordinate so many different things in practice. It's hard to take that slow down track. It's so hard to go and say, all right, we need to break this down. We always want to think about winning the race, and we always want to think about what it's going to take to win the race. But if we take things down and really break it into a nice systematic manner, you could get to that end range, but you're going to have to do a lot of different type of work early on and often that maybe isn't necessarily what you're comfortable in doing. And it can do a lot of good down the road. You may not see it right away, but you will see it down the line. And that's the biggest change. I think being patient as a coach, but also, or even in training, like understanding that what we do now will pay off down the road. Not necessarily immediately on the next 2K or the next time we go hard, but it'll pay off down the road in injury prevention, performance better, and even technical confidence of the athletes will show up down the line. And it's tough.
So what are some of the things that you can implement, or a high school athlete could start implementing to take those steps? In terms of we're talking about slowing down a little bit on land, right?
Okay.
So what are some recommendations you would have them do stuff on land, or what are some things that you've seen, whether it's from your own athletes or general population, in your clinic, that people need to be a bit more mindful about, spend a little bit more time doing?
When it comes to high school athletes, there's a really easy, there's a couple things. I think when you look at training a high school athlete, a lot of the time we push too hard, too fast, too often. And one of the biggest issues I'm getting is early sports specialization. Your kid, he is the best baseball player at 12 years old. He's going to do baseball 12 months out of the year, constantly, all the time. And then all of a sudden you start seeing these injuries pop up. Football, there's tons of them, and I'm seeing them at a younger and younger and younger age. Going back into the sport of rowing, I think the biggest thing, especially going at the younger side of things, if you look at how are you developing through a year run, I think whenever you're a high school coach and maybe you don't have the biggest team of the year, you take a look at your novice crew and it's like, okay, we got to teach them the ABCDs of rowing before we can really get to work on them. And we jump them on the erg first off, and then we go, all right, row. And then we kind of clean them up as we go. We're going to do, whether you coach from the finish to the catch or the catch to the finish, we're going to start them slow and bring it up. But what are we doing aside from that? We talked early in the first part of this podcast of, all right, physiological changes that are needed to be a rower. And we mentioned core stability. Well, core stability is huge. So we need to give them a base of support to do it. The next is physiological changes have to happen. We have to develop that hamstring confidence to get to that body's over, or I don't want to say body's over with you, Joe, to get to that, that weight forward type of hip hinge type of activity. Are we reinforcing that with what we're doing with our athletes? They may not be able to erg very well, but that doesn't stop the fact that we can't teach them how to do a bodyweight squat very well, or even to do a hip hinge really well, or if you start into some kind of kettlebell work. But now, and when I mean kettlebell work, I'm not getting the biggest, heaviest kettlebell I can find. I'm teaching these simple patterns. Why? Because I want to build a motor pattern that I have a chance to build off. Am I interested that my 14-year-old, first year rower can deadlift 225? Absolutely not. I'm really interested in, can he control and get confident into the motor patterns of becoming an athlete? Then we can build off of that. We got plenty of time to build off of that. But if we can get that motors, a lot of those changes done early, then we're not working about so much on technique on the water, because they kind of have a lot of it done without even knowing they got it done. And I think one of the simplest thing is a jumpy, or a simple, if you give them a bar and you could do an upright row, you have to keep if you're doing an upright row, if you're going to open up your back and pull with your arms, you're going to hit your knees with it. So you have to understand that you have to come through with your hips, then finish off, build that momentum up and teach that type of athletic, Olympic lifting type of motion. And you're not doing a ton of weight, but what you really think you're doing in the background is grooving this motor pattern. Whether you know it or not, you're doing it. And that's really one of the easiest basis of kind of developing that. Then when you put them on the erg and you ask them to push legs back, arms back, legs coming back up, it's not they may haven't done on the erg that much, but we just had them work it on the strength and conditioning side of things for a while now. And you'll be amazed how quickly they can kind of get into that athletic ability.
Yeah, I love some of the things you touched on there, really talking about, especially for the younger athletes, the ones that are just starting out, maybe their first year of high school, and focusing just purely on development, right? And it's tough because it's definitely taking a long-term approach to things, right? Mm-hmm. It's not thinking about, okay, how fast can we get this group of athletes for this year to be, right? Let's see what they're going to be when they're juniors and seniors of high school, or, the same maybe applies in college. And then the other part of that is what you're doing on land. Maybe, like you said, you're working on a lift, let's take the deadlift, for example. Maybe they're just learning the hip hinge and they're using a dowel rod.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a big misconception that you need to use weight to get strong, right? So what I mean is one of the things that I'm training for right now is the Strong First bodyweight certification. So the testing standards for men are a one arm, one leg push up, and for women are a one arm push up. And the other skills that are taught but not tested are the pistol, one legged squat, bodyweight squat, tactical pull up. So for that pull up, you're either going at least to above your chin, a bar to the bar, or to the collarbone, and then handstands and handstand push-ups. And then you get into some of the gymnastic stuff like L-sits and, front levers and everything. But the point I'm trying to make is that what those exercises teach, just like with doing a deadlift with a dowel rod, is if you slow it down and you really think about driving that neural engagement, right, from the central nervous system and creating a lot of tension, rooting your feet down into the floor, right? You're contracting that muscle and generating a lot of force into that muscle. And you can get that muscle to fire really hard. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a bunch of 45-pound plates at the end of a bar or whatever you're using to get strong. But what's tough for people to wrap their head around is that they need to really drive that stimulus from their brain to the muscle. So it's this level of engagement that they're really not used to, right? So for example, doing that one arm push up, you have to think about corkscrewing that hand into the floor, right? Almost like you're turning a doorknob. So the hand never moves, but you're turning that hand into the floor. And so what that does is it gives you this spiral effect all the way up the arm. And that really puts that shoulder and that scapula into place and brings a lot of stability into that shoulder. And then when you take that other hand off the floor, you have an anti-rotation component to it. So you have to make sure that you are completely tight through your entire body. And if there's any energy leaks, you're gonna rotate. You're gonna turn to the side and fall. All right.
Absolutely. And if you talk about energy leaks, or you talk about like the inability to kind of break down, let's bring that back down to the rowing aspect of things. We really spend a lot of time building our drivers, but you can create a Ferrari engine and put it in a Toyota Tercel, and it's not going to go anywhere. And that's the biggest thing you see. You can see some of these really good crews, and from a distance, you know that they look good. They look clean. It's the end of you're coming through past Cambridge at the head of the Charles, and then they're still holding strong. Their technique looks good. Well, that's a coach who's building up the chassis as well as the engine. Because when you look at a lot of the technical changes, look at the last 500 meters of a lot of junior high school races. You can see technique breakdown, and you can see fatigue set in. Whether it's fatigue from cardiovascular, but most of the time it's postural fatigue, or you're seeing that kind of adaptation cheating coming along. You're going to see that junior rower watch the novice race next time. You're going to see somebody at the finish, and their knees are going to pop quickly up. They're going to finish their legs, lay back, and that knees are going to make a quick jump right up. And the coach is going to ask them, they go, keep your legs straight. Well, is that coach understanding that he's activating his hip flexors to stop himself, or he or she, from swinging further back because they don't have the core stability or core capability to keep that nice neutral upright spine? It's a synergist activating. You're firing not only you did the hip flexors, that hamstring's probably grabbing, and that whatever help the TFL or the IT bands are going to jump on is going to come through. So we bring it all kind of full circle, building up not only that engine, but that chassis or that stability and that proper movement all tie back in together onto how are you developing a progressive, smart training plan throughout a long period of time, or the period of time that you're giving. What parts are you addressing, and are you addressing everything kind of in the smartest way? Or are you doing, this is what we used to do, this is how we're going to do it, and this is what we're going to do today? We're taking a deeper look at it. And I think if you're listening to this podcast or you're following your website, Joe, they want to know where to go to the next level. And there's a lot of resources out there to do it. And getting that thought done or getting that point across is sometimes a little difficult to find.
Yeah. And that's definitely, I hope the people that listen to this podcast in particular, after they have finished with the episode, they walk away with a curiosity. And we spark their interest to sort of look at things in a little bit of a different lens and be a little bit more open to integrating some different modalities or approaches to complement their rowing. Because I think everything that we've discussed this afternoon, that's exactly what we're talking about. Sort of 30,000 foot view is you can do a lot to help injury prevention, performance, enhance the learning curve, for an athlete. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the erg or in the boat.
Absolutely. And you'll be amazed what that can do for the erg and for the boat. Because if you're just doing just that one area or you're not going into kind of grasping everything, you may be missing a lot of speed.
Oh yeah. And nobody likes to leave something on the table.
No, don't be leaking speed.
So we're coming up. We got about almost 6 minutes left here till we're hitting the hour mark. So I want to do some rapid fire questions. All right, that I ask each guest. These are fun. All right, so nothing. These aren't test questions or anything. This is good stuff. Okay, so we're just gonna run down the list here. So
I'm nervous now, Joe. I'm nervous.
No. This is good stuff. This is definitely your chance to impart some real pearls of wisdom onto the audience, and then hopefully they can use this in their own training and practice. So, what advice would you give yourself 10 years ago, knowing what you know now, having your knowledge and experience? If you could go back in time and talk to yourself 10 years ago, what would you say to Tyler Page 10 years ago?
That one's easy, and Dave will tell you this one too. Pay attention to what you're doing. Pay attention to your heart rate. And pay attention to how are you doing your levels of training. I love doing extra workouts, and I can tell you I did them way too hard. And I never really trained that aerobic base. And I think if I could talk to myself and shake myself, going back a couple of years, take those days as what they are. If you look at training for rowing, that aerobic capacity being built has to be trained in a heart rate and training zone, or you won't get it. And a lot of us get into this always ultra competitive mode where those steady state days, I see it in my own athletes itself, like the junior rowers, you have to find a way to objectively measure where your heart rate needs to be and how are you building up that base. Just going hard and heavy every day will never build it unless you have incredible physiology. And I do not.
Me neither. Beautiful, man. Love that. If you had to pick one exercise to recommend for a junior athlete to be doing, what would it be?
Exercise outside of rowing? Or like
yes.
Strength exercise? Deadlift.
Okay.
Simple.
Awesome. Okay. This kind of builds off the first question. How has your training, and this could be your personal or coaching, how's your training changed today compared to 10 years ago?
I guess you can say it's got much more of a basis behind it. From just the educational and the research background, I'm kind of one of those rowing nerds who likes to read a lot. And, like I've read Volker's book more times than I can admit. But if you take a look at it, like I like reading research. I like reading a lot of different things, whether it's coming from the rowing side of training or the triathlon side of training or the aerobic training. I think if you look back, how I've trained over the years, I'm much more, I guess, scientific about it, and not necessarily I'm believing that it has to be, a 3-week training plan with a 1-week rest with a test at the end of it, but more understanding how much difference there is between different individuals, especially when you're training them. You can accomplish, a 6-minute 2K a couple of different ways, but also how you're going to get the best training out of your athletes has definitely changed for me. I came from a different approach growing up. Back home, I didn't know what steady state was. I just pulled on the oar as hard as I could every day, and we had some success about it. But I remember like the first couple practices I had at Syracuse, and we had to do I wasn't good at that stuff. But now we teach the different levels, and I educate the kids I have coaching to a different level than just go hard every day, because that's not going to accomplish what the goal you're going for. So I'm definitely much more scientific about it.
Cool. Have you had any injury or experience that affected you and your training? And if so, how did it change your training afterwards?
Well, yeah, actually, I herniated a disc my freshman year at Syracuse. I broke a rib after I graduated when I was training with St. Catherine's Rowing Club. And to tell you the honest truth, when my freshman year, when I had I had a pretty bad back, it was almost reinforced me becoming a chiropractor. I thought I had that kind of scare moment, like, can I do this anymore? I had a bad back. It was on and off. And then freshman year, it went really bad. It was awful. And it was during IRA camp. And that summer was kind of refocused myself on like, how do I get this back? Like, how am I going to become be able to row for the next 3 years at Syracuse because I could barely get through getting downstairs, let alone go across. And I had a great mentor chiropractor, and he with full confidence walked in and he's like, you'll be fine. We'll get you there. And I think a lot of the times people equate chiropractor with just lay on your side, we'll adjust you and then you'll be done. No, this was rehab, injury prevention. We took it all the way down the line, and it wasn't just an adjustment that this chiropractor provided me. And he really opened up my eyes to say, wow, like you can really do some cool stuff with this. And that's really what kind of drove me in my future to go, this is the path I want to be. I know I want to kind of go into medicine. I was kicking around a couple different ideas at the time, but athletes is what I wanted to see. And that kind of experience really helped me go. I haven't had an issue since, a couple bad backs here and there going through, but nothing ever to that level that was freshman year.
That's, I did not know that. We've been friends for quite some time.
Yep.
That's the first time that I heard that particular story. So that's awesome, man, that was you took an experience like that and turned it into a real catalyst, for the rest of your life. So
absolutely.
Good for you. Kudos.
Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, man. Okay. Nope, we got everything. So that was the 4 or 5
really?
I had. Yeah. So
okay. We're
just under 60 minutes. Is there any closing remarks you want to offer? Anything else? You good?
No. I a couple things. I think when you look at this kind of stuff, we get going to the podcast type of side of things. There's always a lot of questions that come up, and there's always a lot of opinions or whatever basis. And I think the biggest thing that you can constantly do in the sport is learn from everybody. Try to bring them as much as you can. I'm more than happy to speak to anybody and kind of, I know I talk a little quick sometimes and maybe some of the stuff in the podcast didn't come off that clear, but if you want to get in touch with me, whoever you are, I'm more than happy to explain some stuff. I do teach at the Institute of Rowling Leadership, and what I talk about in this, 60-minute podcast, we spend almost a full year talking about through 2 classes. I'm also, this coming up, not this weekend, but next weekend, I'm speaking at What Works in Boston. So at CRI, Community Rowing Boathouse, What Works, we'll be on a panel with a couple other medical professionals. There's going to be a medical doctor, an athletic trainer, nutritionist. And we're all going to talk about, injury prevention, whether you have us on your team or what to do if you don't have us on our team. And I think if you have a chance, if you're attending that, and you listen to this podcast, please, grab me. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk about them there. But I think the biggest thing is just, I think I tip my hat to you, Joe, because you're really bringing this to the light. And I'm excited to do this podcast. I'm happy to help out whenever you can. And I'm really excited to read your articles every time they pop up.
Thank you, Tyler. I really appreciate that, man. I will definitely make sure to include that information when I publish the episode on the website, so everybody can find that. Is your business located right in? It's in Mystic, right, as well?
It's in Mystic. Yep.
Okay, so I'll include links to your Facebook page, any website information, as well as the stuff for the IRL, and
awesome.
And that way everybody can get in touch with you if they have further questions.
Perfect, buddy.
Cool. So Tyler, just hang on the line so I can give you a proper goodbye. But thanks so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge and experience with the rowing community.
All right, buddy. Happy to do it.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Before we roll to the show's credits, I have a small favor to ask. It takes a lot of time and effort to produce a podcast episode. If you enjoyed this content, please take a moment of your time to write a review in iTunes or Stitcher. Positive reviews help the show grow and gain new exposure. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening, and please keep tuning in.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.